In great attempts, it is glorious even to fail. This is the phrase that I feel encapsulates one of the most iconic weapons to emerge in the last 30 years, a weapon designed to replace and surpass the so-called king of the submachine guns, that would ultimately fall short and fail to be the new dominant small arm it was intended to be. Heckler and Koch's 2001 MP7, despite retaining the name of its forebearer, would be an entirely new kind of weapon, a personal defense weapon, or PDW, a class of firearm built by NATO as the future of submachine guns. But a quarter of a century after their introduction, interest in this radical new development of infantry small arms has dried up quicker than a whale in the Sahara Desert. This new weapon from the world's most prolific submachine gun manufacturer, on paper, seemed to be everything anyone could ever want from such a weapon. It was lightweight, compact, reliable, and more capable of defeating body armor than a traditional submachine gun. Yet the MP7 remains a rare sight across the globe, especially compared to H&K's near 60-year-old MP5. So let's get into what really is a PDW, why NATO felt such a need to invest in this new breed of submachine gun, and what the fuck happened to cripple the success of what seemed like the perfect 21st century SMG. Let's begin with the origins of PDWs as a concept. As I mentioned a moment ago, PDW stands for Personal Defense Weapon, and the overarching idea has existed since the Second World War, even if the name had not yet been conceived. In the years leading up to the largest war in human history, some heretical Americans decided to test the recently deceased John Moses Browning and began questioning the combat capabilities of their God-given .45 ACP handgun, with the light rifle concept being born in 1938, a lightweight, compact personal weapon to arm support troops not directly involved in combat as an alternative to the Colt 1911 many were equipped with. The Ordnance Department imagined a small caliber carbine not dissimilar to the M1 Garand that would be half the weight of the full-size rifle, but still accurate to 300 yards. That's around 270 meters to those of us not stuck in the 18th century. This would emerge as the M1 carbine in 1941, and despite meeting all the requirements of the US military along with being produced over 6 million times, the new rifle gained a mixed reputation amongst troops, with its lower-powered cartridge compared to the .45 ACP 1911, giving rise to a number of questionable stories of the classic Colt handgun having to step up to the plate to effortlessly deal with threats that the carbine wasn't powerful enough to stop. And regardless of the actual validity of these, they quickly spread throughout the military and trashed the carbine's reputation during its early use, though I personally prefer to believe that John Moses Browning decided to teach a lesson to the heretics that wanted to replace his handgun. Although not initially received as well as the US military had hoped, the M1 would be an overall success during the war, and this idea of a simple, light weapon chambered in a cartridge between a pistol caliber round and a rifle caliber round for individual support troops to adequately defend themselves just wouldn't go away, with the US developing the M1 further to produce the selective fire M2 carbine towards the end of the war, along with the M3 grease gun being used to fill the role as well. Soon though, the Americans' attention would shift away from these personal defense weapons because in 1947, the Soviets would do a thing. As the Cold War kicked off, the Soviets began doing a lot of things, but the thing we're interested in here is the AK-47 assault rifle. The Soviets were not the first to produce an assault rifle, but their massive investment in the Kalashnikov pushed Western nations to invest even more in their own intermediate cartridge-chambered automatic rifles. And as this new form of rifle became more refined and widespread into the early years of the Cold War, submachine guns began to fall to the wayside in service. The promise automatic rifles had shown, leading to many viewing the SMG as irrelevant. Until the 1980s, the most prolific submachine gun was the Israeli Uzi, which is, by all means, a solid SMG design, but due to the emphasis on developing assault rifles, it faced little competition for nearly 3 decades. Soon though, the world's militaries and police forces would be forced to confront the reality that criminals and terrorists had not discounted the submachine gun as they had, and as Europe's war on terror expanded in the 1970s, Europe's armed forces realized a dire need for an effective SMG to keep pace with the emerging threat. And thankfully for the world, Heckler and Koch had just begun making a pretty damn good one. While initially flying mostly under the radar, H&K's MP7 would explode onto the scene, no pun intended, with counter-terror units following the British SAS's legendary proficiency during the Iranian embassy siege in May of 1980, with the operatives of the unit ending the 6-day siege in 17 minutes, killing or arresting all of the hostage takers, rescuing all but 2 of the hostages, and taking no casualties from any of their ranks. And in the hands of the SAS, in every image broadcast across the globe, was the MP7. Within a matter of minutes, the SAS had inadvertently demonstrated to the world that not only did submachine guns still have teeth, they were still devastating when dealing with anything that got in their way. With the weapon class many had relegated to a footnote in firearm history, becoming a new universal sight in the hands of the world's armed forces, as well as in popular media as the 1980s progressed. But once again, things would not be so simple for the humble submachine gun. Since the dawn of time, man has sought to kill his fellow man, and we haven't made it this far as a species without thinking seriously hard about the best ways to do so. But somewhere in our homicidal daydreaming, someone came up with a brilliant idea. What if, in addition to going into combat with a sharpened stick, I also wore something that protects me from the sharpened sticks of my enemy? This idea became known as armor, and would first emerge around 1400 BCE, evolving over the centuries as metal production methods and uses broadened, until we arrive at the full-plate armored knights of the Middle Ages, the golden age of armor if you will, and all was well. But then, one day during a battle, a guy wandered onto the battlefield equipped not with a sword, or a bow, or a spear, or insert medieval weapon here, but a long metal tube. A long metal tube that could magically punch through plate armor from the other side of the battlefield. In other words, he'd literally brought a gun to a sword fight. Soon thereafter, as guns became commonplace, armor began to fall out of favor with the world's armies. It was expensive and time-consuming to produce for something that's modern weaponry rendered next to useless. And by the 20th century, a soldier really just had a helmet and a prayer to protect their bodies from bullets. Though there was no shortage of experiments to create a quote-unquote bulletproof vest. But during the 1960s, a completely unrelated project would cause a renaissance in body armor technology, when Stephanie Kwolek started getting anxious about a gasoline shortage. A chemist working at DuPont, Kwolek and her colleagues started a search for a new material to build more fuel-efficient tires out of, and after getting bored with materials that already existed, Kwolek decided to just invent something completely new, creating the polymer commonly known as Kevlar. Kevlar's potential for lightweight ballistic protection was soon realized, and became rapidly incorporated into a new generation of armor and helmets, with the US military adopting the PAS GT Kevlar vest and helmet in the early 1980s. Now, this was all well and good for body armor. It had pulled off one of the longest games in history, and had now outclassed the weapons that had completely eradicated its use centuries before. But for handguns and submachine guns, in the eyes of many, now they were again obsolete. NATO was among those of the opinion that contemporary SMGs and pistols were on the verge of irrelevance, and in 1989 they published a request for replacements for the 9mm cartridge in service with NATO nations. The NATO request asked for a new type of weapon, dubbed the personal defense weapon, a simple, light weapon chambered in a cartridge between a pistol caliber round and a rifle caliber round, for individual support troops to adequately defend themselves. They specified that the weapon must be chambered in a new cartridge with greater range, accuracy, and terminal ballistics than the 9x19mm round, along with an accompanying handgun chambered for the same ammunition. The PDW was to weigh under 3 kilograms, and the handgun under 1 kilogram, both weapons being lightweight, capable of being easily carried at all times, performing well in all environments and conditions, and holding at least 20 rounds each. Work would begin on such weapons primarily by the Belgians, with FN Herstal leading the charge with their P90 and 5.7 designs. But by the early 2000s, NATO would order trials for their over-decade-old request, with the Belgians squaring off against the Germans with the MP7 and UCP from Heckler and Koch. The NATO PDW trials have a lot of myths and misconceptions around them that I'll get into a little, but if you want a full breakdown of these trials in detail, I'll link an excellent video below that goes into much greater depth. As many things have a tendency to do in the military world, the trials became a huge point of contention, and politics would play a large role in how it all went down. You see, initially the trials weren't even planned. In fact, Belgium and France had requested a NATO review of FN's 5.7 by 28mm round in the early 1990s, which NATO actually quite liked. But just before they were set to standardize the cartridge, suddenly the Germans burst into the room, declaring that they also had a cartridge in development to replace the 9mm round. Deciding that they didn't want to be rude to Germany in case they let their imperial instincts take over again, NATO ordered a series of trials for the PDW calibers and their respective weapons between 2000 and 2003, which initially featured 4 cartridges: the FN 5.7 round that was already supposed to be standardized, the new German entry, the HK 4.6 by 30mm round, along with the 224 BOS cartridge from Britain, a cartridge that, if selected, would be suitable for the existing SMGs in service, and another 224 caliber round from Germany that not too much interesting information exists about, though the competition would soon be narrowed down to just the FN and H&K cartridges. The first series of trials concluded in 2002, with the FN round being more capable of incapacitating an enemy and the HK round more capable of penetrating armor, though the report on these tests concludes that a case could be made for either cartridge, giving a nod to the political shitshow the trials had become by adding that, and I quote, "Once national interests are at stake, it is no surprise that a consensus could be difficult to reach, knowing the consequences of such an important choice." A year later, however, NATO decided that consensus was actually not that difficult to reach, selecting the Belgian 5.7 round in 2003, citing superior terminal ballistics, better performance in demanding conditions, and simpler production methods, due to the cartridge's similarity to the existing 5.56 NATO round. The Germans were not happy, and although they refrained from repeating their scenic European tour of the 1930s and 40s, they rejected the NATO recommendation, halting the standardization process of a 9mm replacement indefinitely, with both the FN and H&K cartridges entering service alongside their respective weaponry, though H&K's UCP would be cancelled not too much later. This is what killed the MP7, and what killed the idea of widespread PDWs altogether, at least at the time. You see, in 2021, NATO would finally standardize a replacement for the 9mm round. Funnily enough, the 5.7 by 28mm round that had been all but ready for NATO adoption since the early 1990s. But in the time between that, the lack of a standard NATO PDW cartridge discouraged many nations from investing in developing their own weapons for the cartridge, as they had done when the 7.62 and 5.56 cartridges were standardized during the Cold War. For all their political fuckery, the Germans' insistence on not using the FN cartridge had rendered PDWs a class of weapon with no clear unified caliber or capability, and interest in developing the concept quickly evaporated, with 9mm SMGs, the very weapon intended to be replaced by PDWs, remaining in service alongside their supposed successors to this day. Okay, little side tangent to clear up that last point. With the logistical nightmare World War II had been, the world's militaries were looking to avoid reliving that trauma in their future wars, establishing standardization agreements with allies to use the same ammunition to simplify their logistics. Along with this, every country's armed forces hate each other's weapons, so they often develop their own individual weapons but chambered for shared cartridges. Right, so, with the inconclusive outcome of the PDW trials, the last thing any nation wanted to do was invest in creating their own PDW design in a caliber that might ultimately be rejected by NATO in favor of the other, meaning that they'd have to cancel their procurement of ammunition and then re-chamber all their PDWs for another cartridge, or spend more money acquiring another PDW design, an uncertain, potentially expensive mess that no one wanted to deal with. As the political bullshit surrounding the adoption of a PDW cartridge dragged on, most nations just lost interest in the concept, opting to either adopt one design or the other in small numbers, or just abandon the idea entirely and work on modernizing their 9mm weapons. Okay, hopefully that made things make a little more sense. Back to the MP7. Even though the Germans would fuck about with the PDW testing, they certainly weren't when they built the MP7. Indicative of many earlier successful SMGs such as the Uzi, the MP7 features a magwell built into the grip, with H&K doing what they do best and scaling down an already successful operating mechanism into their SMG, this time reconfiguring their G36's gas-operated rotating bolt design for a much smaller package. It dispenses its ammunition at 950 rounds per minute, with the MP7 being more than able to penetrate NATO Chrysat armor at distances of 100 meters. Picatinny rails adorn the top of the PDW if the flip-up sights aren't to your liking, with a suppressor-ready muzzle, retractable stock, and folding foregrip also coming standard for the original MP7. For a weapon to be used by rear echelon troops, it was capable and configurable for nearly any situation, and over the course of its short life so far, it has gained a handful of variants. The MP7A1 in 2003 would make a few adjustments to the original design, redesigning the pistol grip, making the iron sights more compact, making the stock slightly smaller, and giving it 3 adjustable lengths, along with a Glock-esque trigger safety being added to the design in recent years. The MP7A2 would follow in 2014, adding a Picatinny rail for additional configurability in lieu of the original folding foregrip, along with the MP7SF emerging around the early 2000s as well, being a semi-automatic only variant of the weapon, mainly in use with law enforcement. As with almost every weapon ever made, there exist clones and copies of the MP7, but next to none of any variety are available to civilians, with H&K having never made a real effort to introduce the weapon to civilian shooters, nor produce a legal weapon for civilian use. You might be wondering why I've barely discussed the weapon that's in the title and the thumbnail at all in this video, and that's because there really isn't a whole lot to say with regard to the MP7 itself. Despite becoming quite a recognizable sight over the last 20 years, the actual weapon's history is fascinating until the weapon itself was ready to enter service. Its design is little to write home about. I'd be straight up lying if I said the MP7 was a beacon of innovation and small arms, with pretty much all of the weapon being, at most, an extension of existing ideas. The MP7's lackluster time in service since being adopted, essentially only due to Germany throwing a hissy fit when they didn't get their way, is vastly overshadowed by the strange, multifaceted series of events that led to its creation. H&K marketed the MP7 as the successor to the MP5, implying a similar level of supremacy that would be afforded to its user as had happened in the 1980s, but the weapon was already known to be inferior to its main rival before either PDW was even fully ready for mass adoption. While it has become common in a number of Western nations, you'd be hard-pressed to find any stories attesting to the legendary effectiveness of the MP7. Whereas the MP5's trials and tribulations could fill a library. But in the face of all this, here we are, talking about the MP7 today, and it's a weapon you no doubt had heard of numerous times before watching this video. So I want to return to what I said at the start of this video. In great attempts, it is glorious even to fail. The MP7 sought to be the successor to the king of the submachine guns, designed not just to replace the MP5, but to surpass it and its capabilities. A daunting task for any firearm manufacturer, but one that H&K undertook anyways, and still produced a weapon that has become at least memorable, even if its success has been limited. Was it a product of German political fuckery and a desire to outclass the Belgians? Quite possibly, though it's impossible to say for sure. But in their attempt to catch lightning in a bottle for a second time, Heckler and Koch still created a PDW recognizable to almost anyone with a keen interest in firearms. I suspect, however, that in a few decades the MP7 may be relegated to just a footnote in PDW history, with the 5.7 by 28mm round standardization in 2021. and the 30-year interval between the Belgian cartridge's introduction and adoption due to the Germans and the MP7 becoming little more than a strange tangent in military history, not dissimilar to the saga of the British EM2 and FN-FAL during the Cold War. For now though, the MP7, even in its failure to achieve what it was designed to accomplish, has become an icon of the modern military world, remaining the main competitor to FN's P90 and serving in a wide variety of roles across the globe. Not the king it was preordained to be, the MP7 has still gained a profile on par with some of the best weapons from the last few decades, certainly making it among some of the most iconic weapons ever made. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and maybe learned something new. If you did, please like the video and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next one.